Et voila, I think we are all here. So thank you everybody for joining us for this second in the series of educational sessions. Today's educational session, this one is sponsored by Landscape Forums, and so please do take the time to visit them in the trade show. That's what the breaks are for, and there's also some time this afternoon at about 3:15 when you'll have time to spend some time in the trade show and visiting those exhibitors who are so important to us. So thank you, Landscape Forums, for your sponsorship of today's sessions. We're here today to hear Brett Houston and Ian Morrow talk about Indigenous knowledges and ecology and adaptation. And so welcome Brett, who will be taking questions at the end of the session. And we'll get that session started now and hold for questions at the end. And please do chat in your questions. You can do that during the presentation as well. And we'll have some time at the end.
My name is Hetrum and I'm joined by Dr. Ian Morrow. So next slide. I just wanted to give a little bit of a run through about who I am. I'm Gitchsan, originally from the interior of Northwest British Columbia. I'm an author of a children's series called Mothers of Gitchsan. And this series is focused on teaching young people the interconnectedness of everything within our ecosystem where I'm from. And these are knowledges that I gained from my elders and knowledge keepers. And, we're taught by our knowledge keepers to be stewards of the territories. Next slide. So Gitchsan territory, where I'm from, is shaped like this map on the right. This is an exact interpretation of the shape of our territories and where the culturally modified trees are, the borders. It encompasses about 35,000 square kilometers of territory, not including the Wet'suwet'en, who are our allies to the south. The territory would then expand to about 50,000 square kilometers. So within our territories, one of the most alarming things to our people is the rate at which the glaciers are melting and receding. Even as a child, I remember a lot of the glaciers in the summertime would only recede a very small amount, and that would contribute to a lot of the tributaries that we see within our territories for the salmon to spawn in. But now the elders are noticing the salmon populations are dropping, and there's a number of factors, one of which includes the degradation of glaciers that are on our territory. So with that information, that's some of the things that pushed me into working towards storytelling. I started out actually going to the University of British Columbia for geomorphology, and I realized that that's not the way that I wanted to share the stories of our people. It was something that, it's good, relevant work, but it's something that didn't encompass what I really truly wanted to do with my work. So I got into film and television, and that brought me over to the prairies, where I currently reside, and I spent 11 years working with the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and then I ended up leaving to get into focusing more on storytelling with regards to our cultural knowledge. And this led me to work connecting with the Prairie Climate Center, because they were doing work that was deeply involved with Indigenous knowledges.
So I'll pick up the story there. Again, I'm Ian Morrow. I'm the Executive Director of the Prairie Climate Center at the University of Winnipeg. We're in Treaty 1 territory in the homelands of the Métis Nation, and that's where Brett and I are coming to you from. And the narrative thus far, so the climate science around, the changes to the environment have been happening for decades. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, churns out these reports every number of years, and they keep telling us that we're emitting greenhouse gases. It's creating the greenhouse effect. It's warming the atmosphere and the planet and the water, and the ecosystems are changing and species are changing. And with each subsequent report, we hear that it's worse and worse, and we need to do more and more. And yet there hasn't been the kind of transcendence into action. We keep blowing past our targets year after year, agreement after international agreement. And what we've come to settle upon, the major challenge, is really a communication challenge. How do we break through to the public? How do we break through with policymakers? How do we break through so that the science and the understandings of change from these diverse ways of knowings are acted upon? And so at the Prairie Climate Center, we're quite interested in climate communications and the idea of connecting with different avenues of thought around how you can effectively engage people, whether it's psychology or visualizations and map making or storytelling or filmmaking. And Indigenous knowledge plays an important role in this. And I'm a filmmaker. I've ended up making a number of climate change films across Canada. The first one was Keperangayuk, Inuit Knowledge in Climate Change. And Zacharias Kunuk, the great Inuk filmmaker, and I made this film. It's the world's first Inuktitut language film on climate change. We released it in 2010. I went on to make a film in Atlantic Canada, and then more recently, Beyond Climate with David Suzuki, who is the narrator of this film. All of these films are available online, and all of these films link science with Indigenous wisdom and that diverse way of knowing, ways of knowing, so that we can get a fulsome understanding of the kinds of change that are taking place across the landscape. And when we started to build the Prairie Climate Center, Danny Blair and a group of climatologists here at the University of Winnipeg were developing maps. They were developing the kind of spatial and climatological tools to understand the change, mostly in the prairie region. And I had been making these films across Canada and said, like, can we link these things? Can we link that storytelling and climate science together? And we ended up saying yes and developing the Climate Atlas of Canada. It has 24 global climate models in it. There's a bunch of map variables that you can look at. The interviews, the films are in here, and you can understand climate change across the entire country. This is the actual Climate Atlas. It's got these gridded cells on it. And so you can click into any part of the country to get information about how climate change will affect that part of the country, with all these different variables and more or less climate change in different time periods. And so it's a very powerful tool. And I'll pass it back to Brett.
So in working with Indigenous communities, one of the most important factors is developing a very reciprocal and meaningful relationship. And a lot of that has to do with the trust. So currently, a lot of Indigenous knowledge keepers need to connect with the partners they're working with on a very close level. And establishing trust also means that we follow certain practices and protocols. And one of those things is OCAP, which is the ownership, control, access, and possession. And this specifically has to do with allowing Indigenous communities to control their data. Any of the information that they share belongs to them, and nothing will expressly be used without their permission. And this also led us into connecting to a different type of research. Indigenous communities present knowledges orally, and there's some written and recorded communication, but primarily the biggest reason for this is to continually develop relationships. A lot of people say it was because Indigenous communities couldn't create the written languages. That's not the truth. The truth is that we wanted to continually generate good relationships with the people we work with. Next slide, please. And creating these meaningful relationships is something that I noticed as an Indigenous person, seeing the Prairie Climate Center already developing these relationships with Indigenous knowledge keepers and leaders from across the country. We have Sila Wakluche here and Frank Brown, who are phenomenal thinkers, respectively, from their territories. And they're part of a group of people who guided the Prairie Climate Center into looking at how to better develop a connection, a bridge the gap between Indigenous knowledges and climate research. How can we do this in a way where we can share stories, not just about Indigenous people, but lives in Canada? And how do we better establish better storytelling to get the research information to the people who value it and need it the most, including planners and designers and the people who are building the municipalities and the towns and across the country. So that's one of the things that we really want to work toward and try to establish are these valuable connections. Next slide, please.
I might just add, Brett, that this gathering here on the right in the chair, or the leather chair, is Elder Dave Kershane, and so this is the Turtle Lodge, and this is an organization that we've worked very closely with, and Elder Kershane and the work there we're going to talk about shortly.
And part of the connections that we established brought us into Whitehorse, where the AFN held the first national Indigenous gathering on climate change. And it was a phenomenal gathering. We got to connect with some amazing knowledge keepers, leadership people from all walks of life who brought the story of climate change as with respects to how Indigenous people view climate change, how it's impacting their culture, knowledge, and their lives. And we were able to record some amazing interviews and create this great video around the conference, which you can also find on the Assembly of First Nations website, as well as on the Climate Atlas. Next slide, please. And kind of going back into the discussion about glaciers when I was speaking about my territory, the Kluane First Nation is also nearby Whitehorse. They're within that range, and they're no longer than a day's drive from where my territory is. So they are experiencing the exact same things that we are in our territory. Dramatic change, like our tributaries are disappearing. They had a major river system completely move, and many researchers and media outlets were going there, but a lot of them weren't actually talking to the people who are directly impacted by it and having their input and learning about what they are doing through this change. So one of the things that PCC started working on is creating a film around this project. And here you can see what OCAP principles really mean. You see the elders are reviewing the project. They have say over how their knowledge is shared. So we make sure that every step of the way they're reviewing it and nothing is done without their permission. Next slide, please. So all of the engagement that we had done and completed with leadership in different communities across the country led us into being guided by people like the Turtle Lodge at the Turtle Lodge and the leadership from across the country into creating a dedicated atlas that's for Indigenous communities or Indigenous knowledges. So we're we're in the development phases of that. It's nearly complete, and this will house all the content that we've already created with regards to Indigenous knowledges, but also any new content that we're creating will now live on this page. Next slide, please. So this Indigenous knowledges currently is broken down into a section of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis knowledges. And this just makes it a little easier for people to see something that's recognizable to them. So commonly people in Canada hear First Nations, they hear Inuit, they hear Métis. But Indigenous communities are many nations. It's just like the same as saying Asian or saying something from Europe. You know, there are multiple different countries and nations that live within that one envelope. So First Nations, there's many different nations there. Inuit, there's many different people across the north. And same with the Métis, there are many different communities that are across the country. So this is the easiest way that we can break down the knowledges so that it's recognizable for people around the country, but it also allows us to direct specific projects into these categories. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand it off to Ian, who will speak more about the information that we're creating with the Indigenous Climate Atlas.
And so we were kind of given this charge through this meeting at Turtle Lodge, as Brett was saying, that the communities wanted to see themselves on the map, and that, you know, a map like the Climate Atlas of Canada would not be complete without First Nation communities, Inuit communities, Métis communities, well established and visualized. And so the first run of the Atlas admittedly didn't include this, and it was an oversight. And the importance of creating maps that are decolonialized, that are aware of the negative impacts that map making has had on Indigenous peoples, that maps are a tool of colonialization and that they have been used to do, you know, terrible things and draw boundaries around lands and take lands. And so we wanted to make sure that the Atlas, as it evolved, was mindful of that history of map making, that history of colonization, and the importance of creating an inclusive map. And that's what the elders and knowledge keepers had guided us to do. They also said they didn't want to be ghettoized and outside of the Climate Atlas. They wanted this to be inside the Climate Atlas, given that it's a tool that many people go to, and that we should kind of evolve these things in that kind of braided, you know, knowledge systems that we hear about, and that two-eyed seeing, those ways of thinking about learning and knowing the best of all of these different ways of knowing. And so this is an example of all the First Nation communities. There are Inuit communities, and we're working to kind of map out Métis projects with the Métis National Council and the Assembly of First Nations. And this is a visualization of it, but when you get into it, this is actually what it looks like. So as Brett said, the map has not been launched yet, but this is in our testing environment. And we had spent a lot of time up in the Yukon, and Brett was talking about Kluane, and you can kind of see Kluane there on the bottom left of the Yukon territory. But way up in the north part of the Yukon, the Vuntut First Nation, if you take a look high up in the Yukon, what we're looking at right now with respect to the climate data that you're seeing is the number of minus 30 days. And the number of minus 30 days in a period where we have kind of lots of greenhouse gases mid-century. So this is only 2021 to 2050. And what you can see that in that kind of mid-century period, we're going to go from about 72 minus 30 days in the northern part of the Yukon territory down to 44, a loss of almost 30 minus 30 days on average. And this is actually the mid-century. If you go to the far future in the 2051 to 2080 period, it drops off even steeper. And so when you think about land use planning, when you think about people on the land hunting and trapping, fishing, you would imagine that the ice in the lakes and the permafrost and all of this is likely to change. And so the Climate Atlas gives an opportunity to think forward into the future, imagine what that future might look like, storytell that future to yourself and your community. Okay, if this is what it's going to look like, these are the adjustments that we might need to make. And it is very useful for landscape architects, plant hardiness zones, all these things are changing. And this gives you an example of how to think about that in the context of Indigenous communities specifically, which is the first time a tool like this has been available for the country and for all the territories that make it up. And if we take a look at where we are here in Treaty 1 territory, just north of Winnipeg, Broken Head Ojibwe Nation is close to Seguin, which is where the Turtle Lodge is. And if you look at this is number of plus 30 days. And so the number of plus 30 days in a high carbon far future in the 2051s to 2080s, in the kind of historical baseline, it was about 10 plus 30 days in that part of this area of the country. And in that high carbon far future, it's going to jump up by almost 34 plus 30 days on average, which gets us into the 40 plus 30 days. There's different models that model it higher and lower. So that's the average, but this could be up as high as 67 plus 30 days in an extreme year in an extreme model. And when you think about that and you're like, whoa, what about water? The possibility of drought, growing food. What are the animals going to be doing? How do we think about plants on this landscape for Indigenous communities? Medicine, what's it going to look like? This is a tool that helps us think about that future. And we've made a series of videos that also go along with these quantitative climatological tools. So you've got films within the Climate Atlas, and there's more that will be coming out. And as Brett said, this kind of oral history and oral knowledge and expression of observation and experience is really, really critical. And that's why we make films, because it's the right kind of tool, and communities really appreciate this form of research and information sharing, because it's synthetic and works with many of the communities in the way that they share information. But moreover, there's a lot of solutions in Indigenous communities, and there's stories in here about food security projects, about solar projects, about fishing and activism and reintroduction of bison on the land, and the kinds of things that are really going to make a difference with respect to the resilience and future adaptability of communities. And so these stories are stories of what kind of future can be built and can be shared together to make sure that communities land safely on the other side of this issue called climate change. And with respect to the summit that we held with Turtle Lodge, this is a summit hosted by Elder Dave Kershane, and we brought Indigenous leaders from across North America together to look at this issue of climate change. And essentially the findings were that climate change is a symptom of the issues of the current human condition: greed, arrogance, anger, dominance, selfishness, and how the behaviors associated with that create issues related to climate change. And essentially how these problems, when informed by Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous solutions, can be addressed in a really meaningful way. So we encourage you to check out this paper, which we published with Turtle Lodge and the Prairie Climate Center. And I'll leave it to Brett to wrap up.
So what I kind of wanted to impart is, we're working on a training and capacity building project with the Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training Program, which is part of the BRACE initiative by NRCan. And so we're developing this program which trains Indigenous communities to connect these tools, these climate research tools, to their adaptation planning. And what I wanted you to think about is how we need to create reciprocal relationships with the land. And this is one perspective that we take from Indigenous knowledge is that as people, we've been developing things to shape the land for us. But I think now we need to really look at how we shape ourselves for the land, which you do find a lot of planners and designers are starting to do. And I hope that more do it. You look at Vancouver, you know, a place where I went to school and I lived for many years. They've changed a lot of things in their ecosystem around the city, and the salmon are returning to spawn. So we know that when we change ourselves, the land does the rest for us. So we need to look at this reciprocal relationship that we have with the land. And that's part of one of the projects that we do and that we're creating, is to look at this relationship. And I think that anything that you do going forward is integral and important to keep this reciprocation in mind when you change the things in the lands that you work on or the cities that you work on. So if you had any other questions, you can connect with us here. And, you know, thank you for lending us your ears, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett and Ian. We have a good 10 minutes for questions. I encourage everybody to chat in your questions to Brett. Thank you, Brett, for and Dee, and to you both for this great presentation. Such meaningful work, and you know, I really, there's one phrase that really resonated in your presentation for me anyway, was shape ourselves for the land, and I think that's really key, and something we all need to take to heart. Again, just as the questions come in on chat, just want to thank Landscape Forums again for sponsoring the session. Remind you that the code for gamification is EDS001. I put that in the chat, no spaces. And so again, an opportunity to win prizes there. So again, I do encourage you to ask questions. And since I'm the moderator, I get to ask the first one. But Brett, I'd be interested in knowing what the timeline is for the launch of the map, because I think this is just so important work, and it's really going to inform landscape architecture. So tell us more about how and when this is going to roll out.
The Indigenous Climate Atlas, we already have it in testing phase, so it's kind of in a phase where we were able to use it right now, but it's still just ironing out any of the kinks. And I'm hoping that we can start doing a soft launch somewhere in around August. So we would send that to a few partners, get a few people to get their eyes on it. And then I think doing a hard launch would be somewhere in September, because we wanted to coincide with implementation of our training program, and the pilot is going to start around September. I'm just quickly glancing over to the questions here. Someone was asking if we work with the Inuit groups. Yeah, there is a section on Inuit knowledges, and there's a lot of content that was created by the PCC along with Inuit elders, and including a documentary on climate change. It was all in Inuktitut, and I believe it was the only or the first climate change film done in all Indigenous language, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, that was sorry if that a little bit of a brief answer, but yes, we do have a lot of content from up north.
Excellent. We also have a question here from Grant. He wonders if the toolkits address seeking funding, and how ISC and how to realize climate change adaptation projects. And do the toolkits focus on implementation and long-term management? Yeah,
so the content that we're developing currently, we will have components that talk about resource management and you know, possibility of acquiring funds, but we don't really take them through the funding application process. Typically, a lot of the Indigenous communities that we're gathering with already have a lot of those knowledges and endeavors. They apply for a lot of programming with regards to Indigenous protected conservation areas, guardianship programs, land stewardship programs. There's a lot of those that are already implemented. What we're trying to do is to enrich those programs and the cultural programs that are on the communities to help them bridge the gap between adaptation planning and their knowledges. I mean, technically, if you let Indigenous communities just continue their stewardship, they're already contributing to adaptation planning. But you know, even though we say this program is to help Indigenous communities, technically we're going to be really enhancing the climate research from non-Indigenous community with non-Indigenous communities, because the perspectives that come from Indigenous communities are just so far varying and different from the perspectives that typically you'll see in climate science and in any sort of science, really.
Thank you. We also have a question from Christina. She says, thank you for a great presentation. Do you have any suggestions on how landscape architects can share and disseminate the Indigenous climate readiness training and capacity building paper?
Yes, we have the paper published through our website. You can actually go to climateatlas.ca. Any of the information that we create is going to be on the climateatlas.ca page, as well as the Indigenous Climate Atlas page, which will be linked directly into that the main website as well. And the program itself will be hosted on our websites, but it'll also be part of the Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training Program website, and that'll be up and running shortly. It might even be up now. I'm sorry, I'm just can't remember when the launch was for the website component, but we're just in the development phases, and the pilot of the program will start running in August into September. And we're hoping that the full implementation of the program, which will be both online deliverables as well as in-person deliverables, cross our fingers, for the 2022. So yeah, there's a lot of components to it. And I think for us, one of the most unique experiences for people, it's going to be the hands-on in-person or on the land training that they would receive from a lot of knowledge keepers. And for those who can't connect on in-person training sessions, I think we're going to be developing video content with some of the pilots that can also be a part of the online content, and that way people can gain some of the experience if they're not able to make it to any of those sessions. And again, this is a Manitoba focus, but we want to be able to bring this to a national audience as well.
That's great, Brett. We'll make sure once those programs are launched to get some links on the CSLA website too. So there'll be a jumping point from our website. We have a question from Bev. We have lots of questions here and we're running out of time, but Bev asks, she says, I know Indigenous leaders are being overloaded with requests to participate in numerous initiatives, and it can sometimes be hard to get Indigenous people's involvement. Is there a way to respectfully manage that demand and support involvement?
Yeah, currently we've had a lot of trouble connecting and doing engagement sessions with a lot of the people currently because of COVID. Indigenous communities, more so than others, are at higher risk of COVID and spreading COVID within their isolated communities than any other community. So all of the resources that Indigenous communities are currently working with, all of the time, and anything administrative has all been refocused and dedicated to primarily COVID planning and mitigation. And so, yes, we've had a lot of trouble doing that. And on top of what you're saying is exactly that it's harder to get leadership to kind of be involved. I think one of the biggest components to creating those relationships, again, is building that trust. And I think some communities, if you're going into a community, it's good to start with the leadership, like trying to connect with some of them will use the band office system, which you connect with council members or their chief or an executive director from the band office. But there's a lot of nations like mine who don't use those systems. We use hereditary systems, and each of those parts of the territory is governed by different house groups. So really the connecting and creating those relationships is just by linking to other projects that already exist. I would recommend kind of looking out there and seeing who, like myself, I work with PCC, and I am regularly requested to do lectures, participate in a lot of programs across the country. I do a lot of lectures regularly at different universities with different programs, and it's just something that it really is just connecting on that personal level. And usually when you connect with an elder or a leader, you want to be able to create a meaningful relationship. So having one meeting that's just dedicated to getting to know each other before you talk business is probably ideal. And when we're done with COVID, the best thing you can do is to go in person to those leaders, have tea with them, and connect on that personal level. There's a reason, like I said, we do things with an oral tradition, and that's to be able to keep these meaningful relationships going, because the interconnectedness of relationships is very key to trust.
That's lovely, Brett. It's so nice to hear, to encourage us to put business aside for a little while and get to know each other personally. We're supposed to be ending the session now, but there's one question that that has to be asked here, and everybody's saying yes. Please ask this question before we end. How do you imagine overlapping tech mapping with climatic shift mapping to project future flood watersheds and protect landscapes?
Actually, we have a lot of one of our directors, Nora, she's works directly with water studies, and one of the things that we've requested all the time is to create components to the climate atlas that actually deal with hydrology or water levels or whatever else there may be. And one of the things currently is that we might just be linking to studies, like putting studies onto the map itself, but we still have yet to work out how to be able to get that data in a very relevant and usable way, so that you can just click on a tab. Because right now, as it is, the climate atlas data is a little bit it's easy to use, but it's a little much to get through for a lot of people. But I think we're one of the components we will be working on, I think maybe in next year, when we have a little bit more time, is to try to look at things like um, different studies and what type of data we can overlap with the climate atlas and the climate data, because we've been requested that a number of times, both from Indigenous planners as well as planners from municipalities and government.
Thank you so much, Brett. That's all the time we have. But if anybody has any questions, I think Brett flashed his email address, but you can also find him at the conference and chat with him through by clicking on the People's tab on the left of your navigation screen. Again, want to thank Landscape Forums for supporting this educational session. Remind you to enter your gamification code. And we have a little break now before the next session starts at 2:45. So take that time to visit the trade show and check out some of the technical videos that are screening on the main stage. So again, Brett, thank you. Merci on behalf of the CSLA and the OALA. It's such important work that you're doing, and we want to support you however we can. And we were so pleased that you were able to come today and share this with us.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.